Hey, tonight's journey takes us deep into the darkest corners of history, into the minds of people who didn't just kill, they reveled in it. These aren't your ordinary murderers. These are the ones whose cruelty shocked even the most hardened investigators. From medieval monsters who bathed in blood to modern-day predators who hunted in plain sight, we're unraveling the stories of the most evil serial killers the world has ever known. And some of these cases still haunt the places they happened. If you're into this kind of late-night journey through the strange and unsettling, drop a like or hit subscribe. It really helps keep this going. And hey, I always love knowing where you're listening from. Drop your city and local time in the comments. Let's build this little global campfire together. Now, dim the lights, pull the covers a little closer, and settle in because tonight, we're walking through the chilling legacy of history's most terrifying killers and the horrors they left behind. If you've ever wondered when evil decided to stop hiding under beds and start walking around with a top hat or a respectable mustache, look no further than the early stars of serial murder. Before there were podcasts, Netflix specials, or police databases, there were people who left a trail of victims and a legacy too grim to fade. These were the pioneers of horror, the twisted souls who carved their names into history with blades, bricks, poison, and the occasional touch of aristocratic flair. They were the originals, the classics, and unfortunately, the ones who made the genre what it is. Let's start in London, 1888. The fog is thick, the streets are cobbled, and the city smells like coal smoke and wet misery. Somewhere in the shadows of Whitechapel, a man is sharpening his knife. Or not, we still don't know. Jack the Ripper is perhaps history's most famous unidentified killer, and he didn't even need a last name to make his point. Over the course of just a few months, he murdered at least 5 women: Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. They were all sex workers, all living on the margins of Victorian society, and all brutally, grotesquely murdered. What made Jack terrifying wasn't just the violence, it was the control, the surgical precision, the eerie letters sent to the police, some signed "From Hell," some delivered with actual human organs. This was a man who wanted to be known, and yet never was. Theories have pointed to butchers, surgeons, royals, and more recently, frustrated artists with unresolved mother issues. But whoever he was, Jack the Ripper didn't just kill people. He killed sleep, sanity, and public trust. And then, like a ghost with a grudge, he vanished. Across the Atlantic, a different flavor of nightmare was taking shape. H. Holmes, born Herman Webster Mudgett, because all great villains start with names that sound like tax auditors, was building a hotel in Chicago. Not just any hotel, but one specially designed for murder. Hallways led nowhere. Rooms were soundproofed. Some had gas jets installed. There were chutes for bodies and a basement that doubled as a dissecting lab. It was less Marriott, more madhouse. During the 1893 World's Fair, visitors flocked to Chicago, and many checked into Holmes's murder castle. A fair number never checked out. Holmes admitted to 27 murders, though estimates suggest it could be over 200. The man was a walking insurance fraud scheme who just happened to also enjoy killing. His charm was disarming, his smile rehearsed. He sold skeletons to medical schools and left a trail of mystery that blurred fact and fiction so tightly they're still untangling it over a century later. But if Holmes was methodical and Jack was theatrical, Elizabeth Bathory was sheer aristocratic terror. The Hungarian countess didn't lurk in alleyways or trap tourists. She had castles, servants, an education, and, allegedly, a habit of torturing and murdering hundreds of young girls. Legend has it she bathed in their blood to stay youthful. Historians debate the bathing part propaganda or truth but the deaths. Not so much. Records show over 300 names compiled by witnesses. Her own castle staff testified against her. The twist? She was never put on trial. Too noble to execute, she was walled up in a room in her castle and left to die slowly. Elizabeth's case dances on the line between Gothic fairy tale and horrifying reality. Some say she was framed by political enemies. Others point to decades of disappearances. Whatever the truth, she lives on in every vampire story that hints at vanity, cruelty, and too many candles. Then there's Karl Panzram, who didn't need finesse or aristocracy, just pure hatred. He hated everyone. Men, women, children, himself. Born in 1891, raised in brutality, and institutionalized early, Panzram's worldview could be summed up as, "The world hurt me, so I'm going to burn it down." And he tried. He confessed to killing 21 people, most while committing other crimes like robbery, burglary, or escaping prison for the 20th time. He also claimed to have raped over 10 men, mostly during long, bitter travels across the United States. Panzram didn't apologize. He didn't ask for mercy. He wrote his confessions in detail, with a tone somewhere between rage and glee. His most famous quote, "I wish the entire human race had one neck, and I had my hands around it." When he was finally executed in 1930, his last words were, "Hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could have killed 10 men while you were dallying." Not exactly a Hallmark card, but honest. And finally, we arrive at Albert Fish, a man who makes the phrase "walking nightmare" seem like an understatement. Fish was polite, well-dressed, quiet. He was also a cannibalistic sadomasochist who murdered children and mailed letters describing it to their parents. He claimed to have killed several, but it was the murder of 10-year-old Grace Budd that sealed his infamy. He had lured her away under the pretense of hiring her brother for work. What he did next is still too much for some true crime readers to handle even 100 years later. Fish didn't just commit horrific acts. He delighted in pain both his and others. He inserted needles into his own body. He described his crimes with the unsettling calm of a man recounting grocery lists. When he was caught, the world recoiled. During his trial, he was deemed insane but legally responsible. They executed him in 1936. According to rumor, the electric chair short-circuited because of the metal needles still lodged in his body. These 5 are the architects of infamy, the reasons true crime has warning labels, and why some shadows feel heavier than others. They killed for power, pleasure, vengeance, or nothing at all. And they left behind legacies wrapped in fog, fire, blood, and unblinking eyes. History may turn them into stories. Documentaries may dissect their psychology. But at the end of it, we're left with the uncomfortable truth that some people don't just break, they explode, leaving pieces behind that never stop echoing. If evil wore a friendly face, it probably smiled, like Ted Bundy. Clean-cut, charismatic, and always ready with a story or a flirtatious glance, Bundy wasn't just one of America's most prolific serial killers, she was one of its most disturbing illusions. Between 1974 and 1978, Bundy committed at least 30 murders, although the true number may be higher. He preyed on young women, using fake injuries, broken down cars, or simply a charming personality to lure them into his orbit. Once they were alone, the violence was swift, sadistic, and final. Bundy's manipulation didn't stop with his victims. He represented himself in court, cross-examined witnesses, and even proposed marriage during trial. People watched, mesmerized. Some even sent him love letters. His death by electric chair in 1989 was broadcast like a grim form of closure for a nation that had watched evil wear a mask and flirt with the cameras. But Bundy was only the tip of the American iceberg. Meanwhile, in Illinois, John Wayne Gacy was painting clown faces and hiding bodies. Gacy was a contractor by trade, a party clown by hobby, and a killer by compulsion. He invited young men and boys into his home, sometimes under the pretense of offering work or mentorship. They were never seen again. He buried 29 of them in the crawlspace beneath his suburban home. Others he dumped in rivers. Gacy played community figure by day and predator by night. He posed for photos in full clown costume, attended fundraisers, shook hands with politicians, all while his home became a tomb. His arrest in 1978 revealed one of the most macabre crime scenes in American history. He was executed in 1994, leaving behind paintings of clowns that still sell for disturbing amounts of money. Then came Jeffrey Dahmer, who didn't hide behind charm or grease paint. He just lived quietly in a Milwaukee apartment, where the smell of rot was written off as bad meat or neglected trash. Inside, Dahmer was building a different kind of legación, involving corpses, freezers, and Polaroids that even hardened police officers couldn't stomach. Between 1978 and 1991, he killed 17 men and boys, mostly young, mostly vulnerable, many of them from marginalized communities that society was already failing. He dismembered, stored, and sometimes ate parts of them. He kept trophies, attempted to make zombies through brain drilling, and told police that he didn't want them to leave. He wanted them to stay with him forever. It was a statement of both loneliness and depravity that made the public shudder. When he was finally caught, the country had to confront the horror hiding in a modest apartment complex. He was killed in prison in 1994, not by the state, but by another inmate with a sense of justice too violent to quote. And then there was Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. If the others hid behind masks of normalcy, of charisma, of neighborly charm, Ramirez wore his monstrosity like a badge. He broke into homes, murdered entire families, raped, tortured, and left cryptic satanic messages scrawled on the walls. His spree through California in 1984 and 1985 turned the entire region into a terrified war zone. People locked their windows, bought dogs, and kept baseball bats by the bed. Ramirez didn't have a specific victim. Type young, old, male, female, it didn't matter. What he wanted was fear. He left pentagrams. He said he was a servant of the devil. When he was finally caught, it was because an entire neighborhood chased him down and beat him with a metal bar. At his trial, he smiled. He held up his hand with a pentagram on the palm and said, "Hail Satan." He died of cancer in 2013, after nearly 3 decades on death row. It was an anticlimax he never earned. And then came Dennis Rader, the one who waited, the one who stopped, for a while. Known as the BTK, Killer Bind, Torture, Kill Raider, terrorized Wichita, Kansas from 1974 to 1991. He targeted families, bound them with rope or tape, tortured them, killed them, then vanished back into ordinary life. He sent letters to the press, taunted police. He even named himself. Then he went quiet. For 10 years, 20, people thought he had died or left the country. In reality, Dennis Rader was becoming president of his church council, working as a compliance officer. and living a comfortable suburban life. Then in 2004, he started sending letters again. A floppy disk sent to the police gave away his church. A little more digging revealed his name. When they arrested him, the shock wasn't just that BTK had returned. It was that he had never left. He had been attending barbecues and writing municipal code violations. A husband, a father, a killer all along. These men didn't wear masks of horror. They wore faces you'd see in the supermarket, in the mirror, on the evening news. They mowed lawns, read books, laughed. And in between, they committed atrocities that rewrote what America thought evil looked like. Some smiled for cameras. Some wept in court. Some wrote poetry, while others kept their words for confessionals sealed in police evidence boxes. What they all did, though, was show that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they just smile wider. They smiled. That was the thing. They didn't lurk in alleys or haunt the shadows in slasher masks. No, these were the ones who looked tidy, professional, polite. They could offer you a handshake, a prescription, or a winning smile before quietly ushering you toward your end. Some wore lab coats. Some wore charm like a fragrance. But behind those smiles were appetites that defied reason and resumes that fooled everyone. Start with Andrei Chikatilo, the Soviet Union's walking nightmare. A teacher, a husband, a guy who blended into crowded train stations and bus depots like a shadow shaped into a man. He didn't stand out until he did. Chikatilo was no artist of precision or elegance. He was pure chaos in a trench coat. Between 1978 and 1990, he murdered over 50 people, mostly children and young women, often luring them into forests or abandoned buildings, places where the screams would vanish into the cold. Then came the frenzy. Stabbing, biting, mutilation. He left scenes that baffled Soviet police, who were reluctant to admit that serial killers could even exist in their utopia of the working class. They arrested the wrong men, executed one. Meanwhile, Chikatilo kept returning to the places he dumped his victims, standing over the graves like some twisted shepherd. When he was finally caught, it wasn't because of a dramatic chase. It was sloppy paperwork and a bad tale. The monster was finally named. And when he stood trial, he yelled about being a mistake of nature. Few disagreed. Now pivot west, to sunny California, and a man who once appeared on The Dating Game. Rodney Alcala, smooth-talking, camera-ready, and hiding more than a dozen murders under his feathered hair and white teeth. He was already a convicted rapist when he appeared on television in 1978. Charming the Bachelorette with his grin and offbeat answers. She picked him. Luckily, she never went on the date. Something about his energy felt wrong. And she wasn't wrong. Alcala was a photographer who used his camera to lure young women and girls, promising modeling portfolios, capturing images, and then committing horrors the lens didn't catch. His known crimes spanned decades, but his photo archive discovered after his arrest suggests there were many more, hundreds of unidentified women, snapshots of the soon-to-be missing. And all along, he kept smiling for the camera, even in court, like the lens loved him and he knew it, evil with good lighting. Joachim Kroll wasn't as charming. He wasn't polished. In fact, he was socially awkward, lonely, and had the eerie stillness of someone who never quite learned how to be human. But make no mistake, he was just as lethal. Known as the Ruhr Cannibal, Kroll operated across West Germany from the 1950s to the 1970s, targeting women and girls in a pattern that baffled investigators. He killed, dismembered, and cooked. Human meat stew, fried flesh. When police finally found him, They asked why the plumbing in his apartment building had backed up. Kroll casually answered, "It's the guts from my last one." Just like that. No remorse. Just a man whose fridge was full of more than leftovers. What made him more terrifying was his complete emotional vacancy. His murders weren't crimes of passion. They were routine, like meal prep. Meanwhile, in Britain, there was a doctor who made house call sex. Except his prescriptions had a suspicious tendency to end lives. Harold Shipman was the kind of doctor people trusted. He was calm, he was quiet, he remembered your children's names, and he killed, by some estimates, more than 250 patients over decades, mostly elderly women, mostly through lethal doses of morphine or heroin. It was almost perfect. His patients were already vulnerable, and death didn't raise immediate suspicion. In fact, he even wrote the death certificates, signed them himself. It wasn't until a relative questioned why her mother had suddenly died after just having tea with Dr. Shipman that police began to dig and dig and dig. What they found was a medical career built on quiet murder, one injection at a time. He never confessed. He never showed remorse. He died in prison by suicide, still carrying that smug air of a man who thought he was untouchable. He nearly was. Then there's Jane Toppan, the angel of death, as they called her, though there was nothing heavenly about her bedside manner. A nurse in the late 19th century, she trained at Cambridge Hospital in Massachusetts and quickly made herself indispensable. But her favorite patients? The ones she could tuck in and watch die. She experimented with dosages morphine, atropine, and liked to climb into bed with the patients as they expired. She once said her ambition was to have killed more helpless people, than any other man or woman who ever lived. At least she was transparent. Unlike Shipman, Toppan delighted in her work. She giggled at trial. She confessed over 30 murders, though the true number might be higher. She wasn't in it for money. She wasn't covering her tracks. She just liked it. Killing made her feel powerful. In a time when women were expected to be invisible, she found her voice in silence. What ties them together: Chikatilo, Alcala, Kroll, Shipman, and Toppanis. Not just the number of bodies they left behind. It's the double life, the business card, the smile. They wore roles that society respected: teacher, photographer, neighbor, doctor, nurse. They didn't sneak through back alleys. They walked through the front door, shook your hand. Maybe they even helped carry your groceries. They didn't just kill. They manipulated, deceived, and thrived in plain sight. That's what makes them some of history's most haunting killers, not just the brutality of their crimes, but the precision of their performance. Evil with a handshake and a reassuring grin. Love is strange. It makes people do wild things, cross oceans, write poetry, maybe even move to the suburbs and start a podcast together. But sometimes love doesn't just make you blind. Sometimes it makes you complicit. Sometimes it creates a closed loop of cruelty, a vacuum-sealed pact between two people who somehow convince each other that murder is just a shared hobby. Not everyone finds their soulmate, but these couples did, and together they took a sharp turn straight into darkness. Fred and Rosemary West had all the charm of a bad dream soaked in wallpaper paste. From the outside, they looked like a working-class British couple raising kids in a modest home on Cromwell Street. But that house wasn't a home, it was a trap, a dungeon, a place where walls kept secrets and floors covered graves. Between the late 1960s and 1987, the Wests tortured, raped, and killed at least a dozen young women, including their own daughter. Fred had been violent long before Rosemary arrived. But with her, something shifted. She didn't rein him in. She leaned in. She helped. She lured victims, punished them, participated. The house was wired for soundproofing. Rooms were retrofitted for imprisonment. And beneath the garden, the bones of girls told the real story. When police finally uncovered the extent of the horrors, Fred hanged himself in jail before trial. Rosemary remains in prison, still breathing, still terrifying. In the north of England, during the swinging 60s, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley met over a shared love of literature, photography, and unfortunately fascism. Myra bleached her hair to look like a movie star. Ian read Mein Kampf like it was a self-help book. Together, they became Britain's worst bedtime story. The Moors murders weren't crimes of passion. They were orchestrated, documented, rehearsed. They abducted children. They recorded audio of one of their victims pleading for her life. They took photographs at the burial sites on Saddleworth Moor, smiling like tourists. When the tapes and images surfaced, the country reeled. Brady never showed remorse. Hindley tried to soften her legacy from behind bars, painting herself as manipulated. But the truth was simpler. They brought out the worst in each other, not by accident, but by design. Across the ocean, Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka were Canada's nightmare prom king and queen. He was slick, narcissistic, already under suspicion as the Scarborough rapist. She was quiet, bookish, devoted. When they met, their chemistry ignited into something toxic. Together, they filmed their crimes: rape, murder, torment, starting with Carla's own sister, whom they drugged and killed. It only escalated from there. What makes their story particularly haunting is how normal they seemed in public. They threw parties. They wore matching outfits. They smiled for photos like they weren't keeping horrifying secrets on VHS. Carla eventually testified against Paul in exchange for a reduced sentence, claiming abuse and coercion. But the tapes showed otherwise. She was in it, actively, willingly, and now she's free, walking somewhere out there, with a new name and, reportedly, a new family. Good luck sleeping after that. Ray and Faye Copeland were old, like really old. Ray was in his 70s. Faye was his wife of 50 years. They lived on a farm in Missouri and wore clothes that made them look like they were auditioning for a Depression-era documentary. And yet, they were responsible for a series of cold-blooded murders. Ray had a scam going. He'd hire drifters as ranch hands, use their names to write bad checks for livestock, then kill them and bury the evidence in the fields. Faye claimed she didn't know. She said she just did the cooking, but her handwriting was on the murder list, and her quilt was stitched from the victim's clothes. The Copelands were convicted in 1990, making Faye the oldest woman ever sentenced to death in the U.S. at the time. You can't say they didn't work well together, even if their love language was fraud and murder. Then there were David and Catherine Burney, Australia's Bonnie and Clyde, minus the style. They kidnapped women, kept them in their house, abused them, and then killed them. It wasn't random. It was a plan. They took notes. They kept score. David had told friends as a teenager that he wanted to become famous for something dark. Catherine was the girl who didn't flinch. If anything, she sharpened his edges. They called each other lover while torturing strangers. It all ended when a victim escaped and ran barefoot into a hardware store. One act of survival cracked the case wide open. When asked why they did it, David shrugged, said it was fun, said they wanted to do more. Catherine later testified against him and remains in prison. David hanged himself in his cell in 2005. Their house was destroyed. The neighborhood still remembers. There's something uniquely grotesque about couples who kill. Maybe it's because love is supposed to heal, protect, transform. And in these cases, it did just in the worst possible way. These weren't lonely men acting alone in the dark. They found someone who didn't just understand their worst instincts, but amplified them. supported them, made them worse. Together, they created echo chambers of cruelty, where one person's madness was met not with resistance but with approval. And the world, again and again, didn't see it coming. Because love makes people overlook things. It makes us root for couples. We assume if someone has a partner, they can't be that broken. But the truth is, sometimes two broken people don't fix each other. They sharpen each other's shards. They cut deeper together. So, next time someone tells you their relationship is unbreakable, maybe ask a few follow-up questions. You never know what kind of history they're trying to make. Charisma is a dangerous thing. It can build movements, ignite revolutions, or sell out stadiums. But sometimes it does something darker. Sometimes it slips its leash and fuses with delusion, egotism, and just the right amount of apocalyptic flair. That's when charisma stops being a superpower and becomes a contagion. Welcome to the cult of death where charm, madness, and blood mix into something that looks like religion, sounds like destiny, and ends in a body count. Charles Manson was the guy your mom warned you about, the one with the guitar, the 1,000-yard stare, and a belief system stitched together from acid, Beatles, lyrics, and ego. He wasn't particularly tall, or strong, or even coherent, but when he talked, people listened. Young people, lost people, people who wanted answers and instead got Manson's rambling sermons about race wars, underground cities, and a coming apocalypse called Helter Skelter. He never pulled the trigger or held the knife during the infamous 1969 Tate LaBianca murders, but his fingerprints are all over the ideology. He didn't kill, he commanded. His followers, mostly young women, did the rest. What started as a family on a dusty ranch outside Los Angeles ended in blood-soaked walls and a permanent stain on the 60s counterculture dream. Manson died in prison in 2017, but not before leaving behind a legacy of swastikas, interviews, and a case study in how charisma can short-circuit conscience. Then there was Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, a drifter with rotten teeth, a pentagram drawn on his palm, and a love for satanic shock value. His crimes in the mid-1980s were the stuff of whispered nightmares, random, vicious, and ritualistic. He killed with knives, guns, and blunt objects, leaving behind corpses, inverted crosses, and messages to Lucifer. But what really unsettled the public wasn't just the horror, it was the image. The courtroom smirks, the fangirls writing him love letters, the interviews where he declared, "Evil has always existed." He was a walking headline, a tabloid made flesh. Whether he truly believed in Satanism or used it like a stage prop hardly mattered. He turned murder into theater, and the audience couldn't look away. Herbert Mullen wasn't interested in followers or headlines. His devotion was to the earth itself. In the early 1970s, Mullen roamed California killing people randomly, brutally, and with a strange logic. He claimed he was preventing earthquakes. According to him, the deaths were necessary sacrifices to appease nature and avoid another catastrophic event like the 1906 San Francisco quake. His victims included a priest, his own friend, a family, and a homeless man. He heard voices. He believed the universe was sending him assignments. And in his mind, each murder was a civic duty, a terrible kindness. When arrested, he gave interviews full of rambling cosmic logic. No followers, no cult compound, just a solo worshiper of an imaginary, seismically active God. Israel Keyes played it differently. Quiet, patient, meticulous. He wasn't interested in the spotlight or sending messages. He wanted control. What made him stand out aside from his disturbing calm was the way he planned. Keyes buried kill kits across the United States, buckets filled with guns, duct tape, cash, and tools. He'd fly to a city, rent a car, drive hundreds of miles, retrieve a kit, kill someone at random, and then vanish. He picked victims who weren't connected to him, avoided patterns, and deleted his digital footprints. For years, no one knew he existed. When he was finally caught in 2012 after abducting and murdering a young barista named Samantha Koenig, confessed to several other murders, though he kept many details vague, as if savoring the mystery. He killed himself in jail before a full accounting could be made. He wasn't a cult leader, but his god was order, and he worshipped through chaos. And then there's Adolfo Constanzo, the one who actually was a cult leader, complete with altars, spells, and human sacrifice. In the 1980s, Constanzo was a Miami-born drug dealer who blended Santeria, Palo Mayombe, and his own brand of occultism into a bloody religion. He built a following of loyal disciples in Mexico, many of whom were also involved in drug trafficking. His rituals involved animal sacrifices, until that wasn't enough. Then came humans. His most infamous act was the kidnapping and ritual murder of Mark Kilroy, a college student on spring break in Matamoros. Kilroy's brain was found in a cauldron alongside bones, blood, and other ritualistic ingredients. When police raided Constanzo's hideout, they found the remains of multiple victims, all killed to bless the drug operation. Constanzo didn't go quietly. He ordered one of his followers to shoot him before authorities could take him alive, because in his mind, death wasn't defeat. It was the final spell. These men didn't all have compounds or matching robes, but they each turned belief, whether in the occult, in destiny, or in their own brilliance, into a murder weapon. They weren't content with just killing. They needed a reason, a system, a scripture scrawled in blood, and that's what makes them so chilling, because they weren't monsters in the traditional sense. They were missionaries of death, each with their own gospel. They remind us that evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a smile, or a pentagram, or a lab coat. Sometimes it sings Beatles lyrics, or reads your palm, or talks to invisible voices about tectonic plates. And sometimes, worst of all, it makes sense to someone. That's the part that stays with you. Because once you realize that charisma can kill, that belief can be weaponized, that someone can bury a bucket of tools under your neighborhood park years in advance, you start to wonder how many other prophets of death are out there, planning, preaching, smiling. Justice is supposed to be a process arrest, trial, verdict, closure. But some killers skip the third act entirely. They vanish into the fog, into suburbia, into retirement. They slip through the cracks of systems not built to catch shadows. And when they're gone, they leave behind a new kind of horror, the kind that doesn't end. These are the killers who didn't get caught, at least not when it mattered. They eluded law enforcement, mocked the press, and carved themselves into the public's imagination not just for what they did, but for how long they got away with it. Let's start with the Zodiac Killer, the patron saint of unsolved cases and cryptic trolling. Between the late 1960s and early 1970s, he murdered at least 5 people in Northern California, maybe more. The numbers vary depending on whether you believe him or the police. He sent letters to newspapers boasting about his crimes and included some solved, some still unsolved. He referred to himself as Zodiac, drew his own logo, a crosshair symbol, and promised more bloodshed. But then he stopped. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe he just got quieter, smarter, older. His case inspired books, films, forums, and one very persistent David Fincher movie. In 2021, a group of amateur sleuths claimed to have identified him, but the FBI wasn't convinced. So the name remains a blank, the face a blur. Somewhere, maybe, the Zodiac faded into the crowd, or into the grave, but his mystery, his brand is immortal. Pedro Lopez isn't a mystery. He was caught. That's what makes him more terrifying. Dubbed the Monster of the Andes, Lopez confessed to killing more than 300 girls across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru in the 1970s. He buried their bodies in shallow graves and claimed he was helping them avoid a life of misery. In 1980, after a massive investigation, he was arrested in Ecuador. He was found guilty of 110 murders. The sentence? 16 years. 16. He served 14, was declared rehabilitated, and released in 1994. Colombia briefly held him, then let him go. Since then, he's vanished. The justice system said he was done. The rest of the world isn't so sure. Every few years, someone whispers that he's still out there, somewhere, maybe helping kids cross the street, maybe not. The alphabet killer, named not for any cryptic codes, but for his victims' names. In the early 1970s, 3 young girls were murdered in the Rochester, New York area. Each had first and last names, starting with the same letter: Carmen Colon, Wanda Wakowicz, Michelle Maenza. Each was abducted, assaulted, and left outside town. Despite numerous suspects, including one who later committed suicide and left a note that didn't quite confess, no charges ever stuck. The case remains open, but cold. It became a template for every parent's fear: a stranger, a pattern, a child who doesn't come home. The killer vanished, leaving behind only initials, trauma, and the uneasy feeling that he might have just moved zip codes. The Long Island serial killer Lisk. If you're into brevity-haunted Gilgo Beach for over a decade. Starting in 2010, the remains of multiple women, mostly sex workers who advertised on Craigslist, were found along a stretch of highway. The case ballooned, with bodies dating back years. Victims were often dismembered, their remains wrapped in burlap. Despite multiple task forces and documentaries, no suspect emerged until 2023, when Rex Hoyerman, an architect, was arrested and charged with several of the murders. But for over a decade, the killer was a ghost, the kind that texts, watches, waits. And even now, there's debate. Was it just one person? Were there multiple killers, working parallel nightmares? The details are still unfolding, but the legacy of delay and fear remains baked into the neighborhood. Front lawns with security cameras. Mothers checking Craigslist history. A community that lived next to a serial killer and didn't know it. And then there's the Monster of Florencia case, so labyrinthine it practically wrote its own conspiracy theory. Between 1968 and 1985, 7 couples were murdered in the hills around Florence, Italy. Lovers' lane attacks, gunshots, mutilations. The killer seemed to know the terrain, the patterns, the police response times. Investigators arrested and released multiple suspects. Some died in prison, others were acquitted. Still, the murders continued. At one point, authorities arrested a group of men who they believed were part of a satanic sex cult responsible for the crimes. That went nowhere. Then suspicion turned toward journalists investigating the case. One of them, Douglas Preston, was briefly a suspect simply for asking too many questions. The monster remains unidentified. A bogeyman draped in Tuscan moonlight and bureaucratic dead ends. Some say the killer's dead. Some say he was never alone. But the truth, like the case files, has been shuffled, redacted, and half buried under decades of missteps. What all these cases have in common isn't just the horror of the crimes, it's the long silence that followed, the letters that stopped, the trails that grew cold, the feeling that someone got away with it and might still be walking past you in a grocery store. These killers didn't just spill blood. They rewrote the rules of how long we're allowed to hope for justice. They taught us that sometimes the answers don't come, that sometimes the devil doesn't wear horns or stripes. Sometimes he just knows how to wait. Some killers lurk in shadows. Others hide behind professions that should inspire trust. Uniforms, badges, diploma, symbols of safety, comfort, and care. But not always. Sometimes they're just costumes. And behind them, something cold, calculating, and willing to abuse every ounce of authority to do the exact opposite of what they were sworn to. These are the murderers who wore uniforms, official ones, medical ones, or metaphorical ones, and used them as the perfect disguise. Let's start with Luis Garavito, whose nickname in Colombia was La Bestia, the Beast-stand. Honestly, it doesn't even come close. Between the early 1990s and his arrest in 1999, Garavito admitted to murdering 147 boys. Investigators believe the real number is well over 300. His crimes followed a script: lure young boys with gifts or the promise of work, then bind, torture, and kill them. He kept a detailed notebook of his victims, names, ages, methods. He even mapped their burial sites. Garavito didn't wear a government badge, but he did something far worse. He dressed up as a priest, a charity worker, a teacher, even a disabled man. Anything to get close to children. When he was finally arrested, he was sentenced to 853 years in prison. Due to Colombian sentencing laws, he's eligible for release after 40. Do the math. Then try to sleep. Then there's Dr. Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death, at Auschwitz. A man with a medical degree, a calm bedside manner, and a clipboard he used to play God. Mengele was obsessed with genetics and twins. He oversaw grotesque experiments, injecting chemicals into children's eyes to try to change their color, sewing twins together to create conjoined monstrosities, and casually dissecting prisoners to measure organ sizes for science. He was polite, neat, well-spoken, and completely devoid of anything resembling a soul. After World War II, he fled to South America, living comfortably under various aliases. Despite international manhunts, he died in 1979 from a stroke while swimming in Brazil. He drowned, reportedly unnoticed, in the same world he once tried to dominate by eugenics and cruelty. No trial, no justice, just another vanished monster who got too lucky for too long. Miyuki Ishikawa didn't look like a killer either. She was a respected midwife in post-war Tokyo. Babies were dying in large numbers, and at first, no one suspected foul play. But the truth was more disturbing. Ishikawa was deliberately neglecting newborns, letting them starve or die from untreated illnesses. Why? Because she believed poor families couldn't afford to raise them. Mercy, she claimed. Economic logic, she argued. Her body count is estimated between 85 and 169 infants, though it could be higher. She even collected money from the grieving families, charging them for the service. When she was finally arrested, her sentence was just 4 years. She served less than that. Because paperwork trumps morality, apparently. Yu Young-chul, South Korea's most notorious serial killer, preferred a more direct approach. Between 2003 and 2004, he murdered at least 20 people, mostly sex workers and wealthy elderly victims. He claimed he was cleansing society of corruption and immorality, as if stabbing and bludgeoning people to death made him a moral authority. Yu was methodical. He used hammers, burned bodies, buried parts in the mountains. He even ate some of his victims to cleanse himself spiritually. The details are almost too grisly to list, but what makes Yu particularly terrifying was his total lack of remorse. In court, he said he wished he'd killed 100 more. His mugshot didn't show regret, just contempt. A society's worst urges made flesh and given a voice. He was sentenced to death. Though South Korea hasn't executed anyone in decades, he waits, like an echo in a padded room. And then there's Lenarda Chansuoli, the soap-making serial killer. Her motive? Love. Sort of. In 1939, after losing several children to miscarriage and illness, Lenarda became obsessed with protecting her surviving son. When he was drafted into the Italian army, she turned to human sacrifice. She lured women into her home under the pretense of fortune-telling or help with matchmaking. Then she drugged them, murdered them, and used their blood to bake tea cakes. Their flesh went into bars of soap. She mailed letters to their families to keep up appearances. And she believed that this grotesque ritual would save her child from death. She called it an offering. The courts called it murder. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison and 3 years in a criminal asylum. She died there, surrounded by her recipes, her delusions, and the ghost of a maternal instinct gone rancid. What ties these killers together isn't just their cruelty, it's the chilling way they cloaked it. A doctor's lab coat, a nurse's uniform, a priest's robe, a parent's love. The image of safety used as a smokescreen for horror. They didn't hide in dark alleyways. They were invited in, trusted, respected, applauded, and behind the applause, they collected victims. People came to them for help and never left. Evil isn't always loud. It doesn't always wear horns or slink through the night. Sometimes it wears a name tag. Sometimes it clocks in at 9 a.m., fills out reports, and files the paperwork neatly. It smiles. It says, "You're in good hands." And sometimes it turns those hands into instruments of destruction. Not all uniforms mean protection. Sometimes they're armor for the monsters who know that no one's looking under the mask. It's tempting to think of serial killers as a historical horror, a problem with a mustache, a black and white photo, and a waxy museum figure in the corner. But evil didn't clock out with the 20th century. It didn't retire when Bundy hit the electric chair, or when Gacy's house was bulldozed. No, it got smarter. It got quieter. It adapted to dating apps, gardening tools, social media, and polite neighborhood smiles. If anything, it got closer. The killers in this chapter aren't grainy legends. They lived with us, posted selfies, used emojis, and still, behind their grins and gardening gloves, the same darkness waited. Stephen Port didn't look like the kind of guy who'd make your mother worry. Blonde, soft-spoken, a chef who baked and occasionally performed in local theater. But on Grindr, he was a predator in plain sight. Between 2014 and 2015, Port used the app to lure 4 young men to his London flat. Once there, he drugged them with GHB, sometimes slipping it into drinks, sometimes injecting them directly. His weapon wasn't a gun or a knife. It was chemistry and trust. After the victims died, he dumped their bodies in a churchyard not far from his apartment, sometimes posing them or leaving cryptic notes. Police initially ruled the deaths as overdoses, no foul play, nothing to see. But families pushed back. Journalists asked questions, and eventually it all unraveled. Port was convicted of murder in 2016. The case revealed a police failure so massive it sparked formal investigations. A killer was hiding behind a dating profile, and everyone kept swiping past the danger. Bruce MacArthur liked gardening. He was friendly, older, known in Toronto's LGBTQ+ community. He worked as a landscaper. He also murdered at least 8 men between 2010 and 2017. His victims were mostly immigrants, often vulnerable, some not openly out. MacArthur targeted them, invited them to his apartment, killed them usually by strangulation, and dismembered their bodies. Then he buried the remains in large planter boxes on a residential property he tended. It sounds like a horror movie, but the reality was worse. Police initially missed the pattern, even when MacArthur had been questioned years earlier for violence. It wasn't until 2018, after new evidence and mounting suspicion, that investigators searched the garden and unearthed the truth. Bones, teeth, lives reduced to forensic reports. And all the while, Bruce had kept trimming hedges, smiling for photos, attending church. Evil, mulched and disguised in geraniums. Samuel Little had a quiet smile and a forgettable face. He drifted from town to town, state to state, for decades. Between the 1970s and 2005, he left a trail of bodies so vast that for years no one believed it was all the same man. It wasn't until 2012, after a relatively minor arrest, that DNA evidence finally linked him to a few unsolved murders. But once in custody, Little started talking. A lot. He confessed to over 90 murders, most of them women, many of them never identified. And here's the thing he remembered them: their faces, their clothes, the locations. He drew them from memory, page after page of haunting portraits. Investigators confirmed over 60 of his confessions. The rest remain open. The FBI now calls him America's most prolific serial killer. But for decades, he blended into the margins, living in cars, taking odd jobs, staying one step ahead of a system that didn't track across jurisdictions or didn't care when the victims were poor, addicted, or black. He didn't need a costume. He just needed the silence of indifference. Robert Pickton owned a pig farm in British Columbia. That alone should have been enough to raise suspicions. Farms in true crime stories rarely end well. Between the late 1980s and early 2000s, women began disappearing from Vancouver's downtown east side. Sex workers, indigenous women, people, society had already pushed to the edge. And for years, police failed to connect the dots. Tips came in, stories circulated, but no one searched the pig farm. Not until 2002, and what they found was horrifying. Remains of dozens of women, DNA, bones, items of clothing. Pickton was eventually convicted of 6 murders, but he confessed to 49, saying he wanted to make it an even 50. He joked about putting human flesh into the meat he sold. There's no punchline there, just silence. The kind of silence that fills the gap between warnings and action. And then there's Mikhail Popkov, a former police officer in Russia, known as the Werewolf. Between 1992 and 2010, he used his badge, his uniform, and his authority to lure women into his car late at night. He offered them rides home, safe passage. Then he raped and murdered them, sometimes with an axe, sometimes with a screwdriver. His victims were often found naked, mutilated, dumped in forests or near roads. For years, no one suspected him. He was part of the force investigating the killings. He had a wife, a daughter, and a reputation as a model officer. When he was finally arrested, DNA evidence confirmed the horror. He was convicted of 78 murders, and later confessed to even more. He said he was cleansing society, that some women deserved to die, the kind of logic only a sociopath with a badge can get away with for nearly 2 decades. These men weren't shadows. They weren't urban legends. They were real, recent, and very, very human. They knew how to hide behind systems. They knew how to find victims who wouldn't be missed. They knew how to smile while doing terrible things. And they knew, for a long time, that no one was watching. Modern monsters don't need haunted castles. They need a smartphone, a pickup line, a truck, a uniform, a garden. They walk among us, sometimes literally one backyard away. They don't snarl. They don't drool. They laugh at the idea that evil is easy to spot. And then they blend right back into the crowd. And climate shock. Tambora didn't just erupt. It reached through time and rewrote history. And while the world eventually warmed again, the lessons stuck around. It was a brutal reminder of how interconnected everything is. One mountain in Indonesia sneezes and Europe shivers. One geologic event, and the balance of human civilization gets shoved off its axis. We've seen big eruptions since Krakatoa in 1883, Pinatubo in 1991, but none quite like Tambora. It stands alone at the top of the Volcanic Explosivity Index, a monument to Earth's capacity for drama. And it's worth remembering that the planet still has a few supervolcanoes quietly simmering beneath the surface. Tambora gave us a year with no summer, a literary monster, and a warning in ash. Everything, even the weather, can be undone by a single moment of pressure too high, heat too deep, and timing too perfect. All it takes is one mountain to cough. It sounds like the kind of thing a 1980s thriller writer would make up after too many espressos. A hidden system buried deep beneath the Ural Mountains, designed not to prevent nuclear war but to guarantee it. A machine with no feelings, no hesitation, and no off switch. Welcome to the Dead Hand. Its official name was Perimeter. But to Western analysts, and anyone who values not glowing in the dark, it's better known as the Dead Handa last resort doomsday device, created by the Soviet Union during the Cold War, in case things got really catastrophically out of hand. Which, to be fair, was sort of the Cold War's entire brand. Here's the premise. What if the United States launched a surprise nuclear strike, wiping out the Soviet leadership in one blow? No time to hit the red button, no generals left to give the order. Game over. So the Soviets built something darker, a system that would watch and listen. And if it decided based on seismic activity, radiation spikes, radio silence, and some very spooky algorithms that the USSR had been nuked beyond salvation, it would fire back, automatically. Without asking anyone, it was the nuclear equivalent of a vengeful ghost rigged to throw a punch even after it's dead. The idea behind it was cold logic, deterrence. Mutual assured destruction, or MAD, only works if both sides know they can hit back. But what if your whole command chain's gone in the first wave? That's where Dead Hand stepped in. A way to guarantee retaliation, even if the entire country had gone silent. You launch at us? Fine. We'll make sure somebody launches back. So how did it work? Deep in a bunker, the system remained on standby, usually turned off, but able to be activated in times of extreme tension. Once activated, it would begin monitoring specific conditions. Was there a nuclear explosion? Were high-level command lines silent? Had Moscow ceased communication? If all the boxes were ticked, Dead Hand would wake up. And then a missile, just one, would launch, but not at a target. Instead, it would arc high over Soviet territory, broadcasting coded launch orders to missile silos and submarines across the country. Within minutes, the full nuclear arsenal would be airborne. The Soviet response would be unleashed even if not a single living soul had survived to give the okay. It was the ultimate revenge plan, terrifyingly efficient, pure automation in the service of global annihilation. What's even creepier? It might still exist. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Details about Dead Hand trickled out through interviews with retired officials and defectors. Some said the system had been dismantled. Others claimed it had simply been updated and renamed. Russia, unsurprisingly, plays coy. In 2009, a Russian general casually mentioned in an interview that perimeter still existed and was fully operational. Then he smiled. Cool, very reassuring. Unlike the flashy nuclear briefcases and dramatic red buttons you see in movies, the real fear with systems like Dead Hand is their silence. They're not about drama. They're about inevitability. No last-minute hero, no stand-down call. Just a machine doing exactly what it was built to do. Interpret the end of the world as a green light. And yes, the United States has its own complex system of redundancies. But it doesn't have this. Not a standalone machine built to avenge a country that may no longer exist. That's a uniquely Soviet flavor of paranoia meets technology. Equal parts terrifying and elegant in a monstrous way. Today, the world still has thousands of nuclear weapons, still has launch protocols, still has humans staring at radar screens in the middle of the night. But somewhere there's still a bunker, still a system on standby, still a signal waiting for silence. Because Dead Hand was never about peace. It was about promise. A dark, machine-enforced promise that even in death, someone or something would get the last word. 66 million years ago, Earth had a bad day. A really, really bad day. At the time, the planet was lush, full of towering trees, warm oceans, and dinosaurs basically running the show. There were no cities, no people, no worrying about taxes or cell service. Just thunder lizards, doing thunder lizard things until, from the cold silence of space, came a rock the size of a small mountain, moving faster than anything they could comprehend. It didn't come quietly. This was no ordinary space pebble. It was 6 miles wide and traveling at more than 40 miles per hour. Scientists call it the Chicxulub impactor, named after the region in Mexico where its crater still yawns beneath the surface of the Yucatan Peninsula. When it hit, it didn't just make a splash, it punched straight through the Earth's crust like a hot knife through prehistoric butter. The initial impact was like every disaster movie cranked up to 11. The asteroid released energy equivalent to about 100 trillion tons of TNT. That's over 1 billion times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Everything near the impact site was instantly vaporized. The surrounding rock liquefied. A crater nearly 100 miles wide and 20 miles deep was carved into the Earth in seconds. But the real extinction didn't come from the impact. It came from the aftermath. The force of the collision threw molten rock, ash, and dust high into the atmosphere. Some of it re-entered Earth's skies, like thousands of shooting stars, igniting global firestorms. Forests burned, oceans boiled at the surface. Creatures that weren't obliterated on impact faced a new, slower death sentence. Because the dust and sulfur blocked out the sun. For months, possibly years, the planet was plunged into darkness. Photosynthesis stopped. Plants died. Then the herbivores. Then the carnivores. Temperatures plummeted. Acid rain fell. The food chain collapsed like a house of cards during a hurricane. In the fossil record, it shows up as a thin literally, a thin dark band of clay called the Cretaceous Paleogene, KPG boundary, found all over the world. That line contains high levels of iridium, a rare metal on Earth but common in asteroids. It's like a planetary signature, a cosmic receipt left behind by the object that wrecked an entire era. And yet, not everything died. Birds, distant cousins of dinosaurs, somehow survived. So did small mammals, burrowers, and anything lucky enough to stay out of the way and eat whatever was left. They became the new inheritors of the Earth, and eventually, they evolved into you. But here's the part that messes with your head. This wasn't a freak accident. There are lots of space rocks out there. The asteroid belt alone contains millions of objects. Near-Earth objects, NEOs, pass by us all the time. Most miss. Some come really close. The one that hit 66 million years ago? We didn't have telescopes to see it. No defense systems. No warning. If it happened again, we'd maybe have a few days. Weeks if we're lucky. Months if it's polite. NASA and other space agencies do track asteroids now. They're watching. But even today, we're still in the early days of planetary defense. We've got plans to push it with a spacecraft, paint it white so sunlight nudges it off course, maybe even blow it up, but nothing that's been truly tested against something that size. So yeah, one rock, one bad day. Dinosaurs never saw it coming. And honestly, neither would we. It was 8:07 a.m. on a quiet Saturday morning in Hawaii, January 13th, 2018, when thousands of cell phones across the islands lit up with a message that no one is ever prepared to see. Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. No typos, no vague phrasing. It was clear, it was terrifying, and it was blasted to everyone at once through the official emergency alert system. Phones buzzed, TVs beeped, sirens wailed. And for 38 surreal minutes, over 1 million people genuinely believed the world was ending. The threat wasn't abstract. Tensions between the US and North Korea had been rising for months. Missile tests, rhetoric, real fear. So when the alert hit, people assumed the worst had come. That a nuclear missile was already on its way, skimming over the Pacific, unstoppable, minutes from impact. Reactions ranged from practical to poetic to absurd. Some dove into bathtubs with mattresses over their heads. Some herded their children into storm drains. Others froze in place, eyes glued to the sky. Tourists ran into hotel basements. A few couples got engaged. People cried. People called their parents. People prayed. And then there were the pancake people. At diners across the islands, some folks just kept eating. Maybe they didn't see the alert. Maybe they didn't believe it. Or maybe they figured, if this is the end, I'm going out with syrup. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, emergency management staff were panicking for very different reasons. There was no missile. There never was. The alert had been sent in error-triggered during a shift change by an employee who selected the wrong option from a drop-down menu. Instead of clicking Test Alert, he clicked the real one. Then, to make things worse, the system asked him to confirm, and he did. Because, he said later, he thought, it was real. No one caught the mistake immediately. The system wasn't built with a simple unsend button. It wasn't like tweeting a bad take. Once the warning went out, it just stayed out. For 38 full minutes. Eventually, a correction was issued. Phones buzzed again. There is no missile threat or danger to the state of Hawaii. Repeat. False alarm. Relief spread like a wave, but so did rage. How could this happen? Why wasn't there a failsafe? Who built a system where the fate of public panic hinged on 2 clicks? The fallout wasn't nuclear, but it was messy. The employee who sent the alert was let go. Protocols were overhauled. The governor of Hawaii admitted it took him 17 minutes to tweet the correction because he forgot his Twitter password. You can't make that up. What this whole incident revealed beyond the quirks of digital bureaucracies, how fragile that line between ordinary and apocalyptic really is. One message, one mistake, and suddenly, everyone is forced to look their mortality in the face before breakfast. Some panicked, some froze, some held their kids, some poured more coffee. But for a little while, everyone lived in that strange existential pause between certainty and oblivion. And for better or worse, when the end didn't come, people had stories about fear, about love, about pancakes. In the spring of 1910, the world looked up and collectively freaked out. Halley's Comet was coming. Not just visible, not just pretty, but on a trajectory that would send Earth right through its tail. For astronomers, this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. For the public, it was an open invitation to imagine the most dramatic sci-fi doom possible. Here's what actually happened. Halley's Comet, which swings by every 75 to 76 years, was returning for its 1910 visit. This wasn't its first rodeo, but this time, thanks to improved telescopes and growing public awareness, People were ready for it, sort of. The comet became visible to the naked eye in April, and newspapers began covering it like a celestial celebrity. It was bright, dramatic, and streaked across the sky like a burning dagger. But then came the twist. Astronomers announced that on May 19th, Earth would pass through the comet's tail. Cue the existential crisis. Now, comets are mostly made of dust, ice, and gas. Their tails can stretch millions of miles across space. And while incredibly thin so sparse, they wouldn't even fog your glasses. The idea of a giant cosmic exhaust pipe brushing against Earth triggered all kinds of imaginative panic. To make things worse, scientists had recently discovered that comet tails contain cyanogen, a cyanide-related compound. It's harmless in the concentrations involved, but this detail got snatched up and mangled by sensationalist headlines. One French astronomer casually noted the compound's presence, and newspapers ran with it. The result? "Comet may wipe out all life," screamed one American headline. "Cyanide gas. In the sky. World doomed," said another. Snake oil salesmen rejoiced. Suddenly, everyone and their uncle was selling comet-proof tonics, anti-comet pills, and gas masks, actual gas masks, for a gas that wasn't even remotely dangerous in spacetail form. Some people sealed their windows with wet towels. Others partied like the end was guaranteed. One man in Texas reportedly built an airtight vault for his family, packed with canned food and holy water. It leaked. Religious groups split down the middle. Some preached that the comet was a sign of divine wrath, urging repentance. Others saw it as confirmation of prophecy, a celestial blessing. Meanwhile, scientists tried in vain to calm everyone down. They explained how diffuse the tail was, how Earth passed through comet tails all the time, just not this visibly, but the damage was done. When you combine new science, old superstitions, and a dash of media chaos, you get people buying gas masks to survive outer space farts. And then, the big day arrived. People gathered in parks, rooftops, and town squares. Some watched quietly, others held signs. A few danced. The comet hung in the sky, otherworldly and unbothered. The Earth drifted through its tail for 6 full hours, and absolutely nothing happened. No one died from comet gas. No birds fell from the sky. The air didn't smell weird. The sun came up the next morning like it always did. The newspapers quickly pivoted back to politics and prize fights. The gas masks ended up in closets and attics. But the moment stayed, a strange, beautiful panic that united the world in cosmic awe and collective irrationality. For a brief time, in 1910, humans remembered that we're passengers on a rock flying through space, and that sometimes that space contains mysterious glowing things that don't care what we think. And while the next appearance of Halley's Comet in 1986 was met with more curiosity than panic, that 1910 flyby remains a perfect snapshot of what happens when science, imagination, and good old-fashioned fear collide. We looked up, we panicked, and then we moved on, because, as it turns out, Earth is remarkably good at not dying. At least, not that day.